So, it's a holiday season, and I hear a lot of things about sitting around, things getting fat, and most of the time people say, oh, it's those damn carbs. Well, they might be right, but, they'll go on to say, the new generation, they have all these fancy computers, they've cut out carbs completely. They don't even have them. And, there's a lot of misconceptions about carbs and how they play a role in wintertime conditions. So, first I want to get into what carbs are. Carbs are used for, fuel. And there's a few different ways we can get fuel, but carbs are one of those ways. And there's also like what I would like to term as simple carbs and complex carbs. Now, let's get into detail about that. Simple carbs, well, let's first go to complex carbs. Complex carbs would be something that has a lot of vacuum lines to it, million screws, that has to deal with emission stuff. And simple carbs, like what I have here, which is a Weber IDF carburetor, partially taken apart, is something I call a simple carb. There's no vacuum lines to it. There's minimal screws. It's got two barrels, but the barrels work for, basically the same. It's not a small and big one. They're both the same. So I'd say this is a fairly simple carb. Now, let's go on and talk about how these carbs can affect us differently during wintertime from summertime. So, let's see how carbs can affect us differently in the winter and summer. Now, some people would say they associate running fat, with wintertime. Well, that's not always the case. Usually, it would be the opposite. You see, the fuel that we use for wintertime it contains more ethanol, which can swell up rubber inside the carburetors and cause them to run even leaner, or bad. The other way that wintertime can cause fuel to run leaner is that the air is much colder, and so if the air is much colder and much more dense, to compensate for that you would need to run more fuel with the same amount of air intake. However, a carburetor doesn't adjust to that because it's not fuel injected. So if you are running fat, a possibility would be maybe some vacuum lines. Again, if you're using complex carbs, as I like to call it, your vacuum lines could be getting mist from the water, or they're tightening up, and now they're running differently so that they're bringing in less air, which would cause you to run a little fatter. So let's talk a little bit more about the carburetors and how they can run differently in the winter. And remember what I said earlier about sitting around. So a little more about sitting around. It's wintertime, people don't get out quite as much, and what happens with carburetors when they sit around is that the fuel tends to dry up within the carburetor itself. Now, normally this isn't a problem if it does it once in a while, but if it's sitting over and over, the fuel that's in the carburetor tends to kind of gunk up. Fuel can be very sticky when it dries. So what happens is the tiny little holes that you have in your carburetor become clogged with excess fuel gunk, and you're not quite able to get the fuel in the same manner as you did before, like say during the summer. So it's really important to either dry out your carburetor before you park it, or run your car every so often to make sure the fuel is flowing in there. Now, if it does get gunked up, you just take it apart and follow directions, and you really, really work those holes as good as you can to get them clean. You try to blow as much as you can into those with some cleaner. We can go back to my carburetor for a second, and I'll show you, a few little things to check if you just want to take it apart a little bit to see if it might be gunked up. So let's say you have a feeling that your carburetor might be gunked up. What do? Well, you can do a visual inspection. You can look deep down in there with a flashlight and see if there's any sticky mess around the valves. Now, the valves would be on the bottom. They look like these. And you want them to be fairly clean, and you want the intake to be clean as well. Now, you may not be able to see them because they might be in there, but an indicator of them being dirty is if when you open and close it, it's a little sticky. as you close. Now, to really start getting deep down in there, you're going to have to start stripping your carburetor apart. Now, you might be able to take it apart just a little bit without damaging anything, without messing up any gaskets, but be careful if you do. So first, I have this useless thing. Probably not going to be on your carburetor. So next you'll have the top of the carburetor. Now, these are probably held on just by a few bolts or screws. When you take it off, though, be careful not to damage the gasket underneath, or else you'll have to head to the hardware store and get another one. Now, what you want to do is look down into the bowls. Now, the bowls of the carburetor are here. They call it a bowl because it's the bowl where the fuel sits. Now, these bowls can get very dirty because they have fuel sitting in them a lot. If you look in there and it looks dirty, you've got dirt, you've got grime, anything like that, you're probably going to need to take your carburetor apart, clean it out, or send it to someone who knows what they're doing. Now, say everything looks clean, your carburetor's still not quite running right, but close. There's another thing you can do. So here's what you can do. So this is the whole assembly of a carburetor. Now it's got the intake manifold, it's got the base where the carburetor is, and it's got gaskets around the top. Now each one of these surfaces has different kind of a gasket. Now some carburetors might also have vacuum lines. Now if your carburetor is still not quite running right, what you want to do is you're going to want to get it wet. Now what you're going to do is you're going to take some WD-40 or something similar like that, and you're going to spray around every place that has a surface, a mating surface. So on this part is where it would mate to the cylinder head. Now you want to spray in there. If for some reason the RPMs of the engine changes, then you know you might have a vacuum leak. And you'll also want to get it wet all around the base here, all around it, to make sure that it's not in between the carburetor and intake manifold. And you'll want to spray down the carburetor as well. Make sure you get all that wet all around the end and see if it changes. Now, if there's some change in how fast things are running, then you'll probably want to rebuild things, get it done, and take care of business. So this is my little video on carburetors and the holiday season. Hope you have a good Christmas.